second of this year's Brain and Mind workshops. I extend, as usual, a very special welcome to those who are new to workshops, as well as to the A-level students who've come tonight. Can you just raise your hands if you are an A-level student, just so I can get a sense of... Excellent, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the evening. I also want to extend a warm thank you to St Hilda's College for providing the funding for this year's workshop. Each year when we're planning our program, we aim as far as possible to have a theme or at least a thread that can run through the 3 workshops that are now regularly at the beginning of each of the 3 terms. So this year we began with a workshop on perception and the brain. Tonight we're following that up with memory and the brain, and Trinity term will be on time and the brain. And for those of you who want to put that in your diary, that's going to be on Thursday, the 10th of May. I can also tell you that we've already planned next year's workshops, which will be on topics related to mental health. We're going to be discussing dementia in the brain, adolescent risk-taking in the brain, and criminality in the brain. And we're rather excited, especially about that one, because we've got Val McDermott, who's agreed to talk. She's, if you don't know her, one of Britain's leading crime writers. She's an alumna of St Hilda's, and some of you might know her books that have been made into, I think it's, I don't know which of the channels, but it's a TV series called Wire and Blood. So she'll be giving us her insight on crime writing in the criminal mind as well. So I think that would be really quite exciting. If any of you want to keep up with what we're going to do or what we have done, we're videoing these each term so you can look back and catch up, and that's on our website. If you go to the St Hilda's website, click on research, and then on research networks, you'll find information relating to all this. Now, although I'm the one who stands up here each term and introduces these events, I would like to just take a little bit of time tonight to tell you that I'm not the only one who does the organization of this. We've got an executive committee of 4 of us here at St Hilda's. I'm the philosopher who puts the input on that side of things, but we have, and there are people who sit up on the panel as well as the speakers, and they're the executive committee. So I just want to introduce the other members tonight. So there's Anne Dowker, Dr. Anne Dowker, who's our tutor in psychology here at St Hilda's. Anne, yeah. And then we have another psychologist who likes to sit down there. That's Stephen McHugh, who is also a psychologist, tutor here at St Hilda's with more an emphasis on the neuroscience of things. And then there's Dr. Michael Glitch at the very end, who is our tutor in medicine. And it's interesting the way our different interests have intersected and brought together in these workshops. So tonight's topic is memory. Treatises have been written on this topic for centuries. A well-known treatise was written by Aristotle on memory and recollection. It's been argued by the philosopher Julia Annis that what Aristotle here discusses can be taken to refer to different kinds of memory, what she labeled personal and non-personal. And she argues that his work can be taken to be a precursor to much modern work in psychology. That there are different kinds of memory has become the bread and butter of working psychologists who differentiate, I hope I've got this right, between episodic memory, semantic memory, non-declarative memory, working memory, prospective memory, and autobiographical memory. Perhaps there are even more. As well as issues in philosophy and psychology to do with memory, there's what neuroscience scientists are discovering about the way in which our brains operate when we perform feats of memory. To tell us more about some of these issues, I'm now going to turn to our panel of experts. The first of our speakers tonight is David Bannerman, Professor of Behavioral Neuroscience here at Oxford University. David.
Thank you very much. I'll hold off on the applause and wait and see if this works. So, I think I should start by saying that although I've been studying learning and memory for 28 years now, I certainly don't feel like an expert But if there's one thing that we've learnt in the last year and a half is that experts are overrated. So this is very much the view of a non-expert. Okay, so pretty much every undergraduate essay that I've ever marked on learning and memory, or every PhD thesis I've examined, starts off with this sort of bland, generic statement like this. Memory is everything, it lies at the heart of our very being, it defines our personalities and makes us who we are. Nearly every essay and thesis you get starts with a statement like this. But it's true. It's true. And if you stop and think about it, isn't it amazing that we can remember things that happened in our past? It's absolutely fantastic. So, for example, I can remember the party that I went to at the weekend. Just about, at least. This is Stephen's house, by the way, just in case anyone's wondering. And that's a wonderful thing, to be able to remember things that happened in our past. All those wondrous, joyous events that have happened in our lives. And what could be more joyous and wondrous than the arrival of a first child? A happy moment if ever there was one. And of course, learning and memory also underlies all the skills that we acquire as we go through life. It helps us solve complex cognitive problems. And again, if you think about it, the fact that some of these memories last for years. So for example, I can remember when England used to win test matches at cricket. Even more impressively, as a Scotland rugby fan, I can remember when we used to beat England at rugby. And I'll say it before anyone else does, yes, the photo's in black and white, that shows you how long ago it was. So we can remember things for years, and of course not all memories, this is obviously a good memory, it brings back lots of good thoughts. Of course not all memories are good memories, and just for balance I thought I needed to include a match with a slightly different outcome. So memories are great, and they really do shape who we are and what we are. But of course, learning memory doesn't always work properly. And many, if not all, neuropsychiatric disorders probably reflect changes in the way that individuals learn about the world. So, for example, there are some individuals who will more strongly remember the bad or aversive things that happen in their life compared to the good or rewarding things. And this might be one reason, for example, why people develop disorders like depression. They put more emphasis or weight on the bad things that have happened in their lives. In other individuals, you might get situations where people learn the wrong things about the world. So they form the wrong associations between different events and how they happen in the world. And this might lead them to come to the wrong conclusions about the way that the world works. And this might be very important in disorders like schizophrenia, particularly in the context of things like delusions, where people start to think, to form the wrong impressions about how things interact in the world and how the world works for them. And schizophrenia is an interesting one. We know quite a bit about schizophrenia now. For example, we know that it's highly heritable. So it's got a heritability of somewhere between 65 and 80%. So there's a huge genetic component to schizophrenia. You're much more likely to develop the disorder if you have a certain set of genes. And in the last 10 to 15 years, the scientific and medical communities have spent millions and millions of pounds trying to identify what the genetic changes are that might predispose someone to developing schizophrenia. And over the last 2 or 3 years, a number of very high-profile papers have been published in the literature, and we've now come up with a list of about 108 genes that seem to be very important in determining whether an individual develops schizophrenia. And out of this list has fallen the secret to schizophrenia. Okay? So it's soy sauce. Okay? Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea, you're not going to get schizophrenia from eating too much Chinese food. But soy sauce, or monosodium glutamate, as it's also, of course, known, glutamate is one of the major neurotransmitters in the brain. Okay? And lots of these risk genes for schizophrenia are associated with glutamate, and particularly with a property of glutamate neurotransmission called synaptic plasticity, which I'm going to describe to you in a second. So there's lots of evidence linking glutamate to schizophrenia. Okay? Now, glutamate is a neurotransmitter, so what that means is that it's responsible for one nerve cell talking to another. Okay? So in the nervous system in the brain, you've got lots of neurons, and they join together at special contacts called synapses. Okay? So where the end of one neuron comes in, it will make a contact with a second neuron. Okay? So you might have an electrical impulse that passes along this fiber, like an electric current going along a cable. when it gets to the end of that cable, it needs to make contact with the next neuron in the line, okay? And it does that at these special junctions called synapses. And the way that it works is that when the electrical impulse gets to the end of the neuron, it causes the release of the neurotransmitter, like soy sauce or glutamate, and then the glutamate diffuses across this little gap between the neurons, and it binds to special proteins on the second neuron called receptors, okay? And so there's lots of special proteins called glutamate receptors which bind the glutamate and then cause electrical activity in the second cell. And that's the way that the neurons in the brain talk to each other. That's the way that they communicate. And as I say, this communication between neurons depends on soy sauce. Okay? So glutamate is very important in terms of neurotransmission. An amazing feature of the nervous system is that you can make these synaptic connections get stronger or weaker. And this is what synaptic plasticity is. Okay? So throughout life and throughout waking experience, you can change the strength of these connections. So you can effectively turn the volume up or down on neurotransmission in the brain. Okay? And that's synaptic plasticity. And as I say, it depends very much on glutamate and these glutamate receptors. Okay, so how might you make a synapse stronger? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One possibility is that you release more of the glutamate. Another possibility is that you have more of these receptors, these glutamate receptors, present on the membrane of the second cell. And actually, there's empirical evidence that both of these things happen. So you get more glutamate release, and then you also get more of these receptors present on the neuron, on the membrane of the second neuron. Okay, allowing the additional transmitter to bind to more of these receptors. And that's how plasticity is thought to happen. And this insertion of extra glutamate receptors into the neuronal membrane depends on a particular kind of glutamate receptor called GLUA1. Okay? And interestingly, GLUA1 is one of these genes that's different in people who are going to be more likely to develop schizophrenia. Okay? So there's changes in the genetic makeup of an individual which affect the amount of these GLUA1 proteins that you have present in the neuron may predispose certain individuals to develop schizophrenia. Okay? Interestingly, if you look in the brains of schizophrenic patients after they die, so if you look at post-mortem brain tissue, what you also find is less of these GLUA1 proteins present in the brain. So there's lots of evidence linking this particular protein GLUA1 to the development of schizophrenia. Okay? So what does GLUA1 do? Well, at the synaptic level, it's very important for allowing us to change the strength of these connections. What does it do at the behavioral level? Well, we don't have any drugs that we can use to block GLUA1 receptors in the brain. There are no specific drugs that we can give to an animal, for example, to block these receptors. So the way that we can study GLUA1 is to make a genetically modified mouse where we knock out the gene that codes for this GLUA1 protein. Okay? So these mice are entirely normal, apart from the fact that they lack one gene that makes one protein. Okay? They lack the GLUA1. Everything else about them is absolutely normal. Okay? So you can make these mice, and if you look at them in their home cages, they look perfectly normal. They just look like their brothers and sisters who are normal wild-type or control mice. You wouldn't be able to pick them apart by looking at them. They have the normal behavioral repertoire that any other mouse would have. Now, of course, the prediction would be that if you lack this protein, you're going to have problems with learning and memory. Lots of people have suggested that synaptic plasticity, and in particular, a particular form of synaptic plasticity called LTP, particularly in a brain region called the hippocampus, may be very important for forming memories, and in particular for forming associative memories. Okay? Now, by associative memories, what I mean is the ability to learn about the relationship between stimuli or events in the world. The classic example would be Pavlov and his dogs. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Pavlov. So Pavlov used to ring a bell every day before he fed the dogs. And gradually, after time, what he found was that he could ring the bell and the dogs would start salivating even in the absence of the food. Okay? So even before the food arrived, the dogs started salivating, suggesting that the dogs had formed some link between the ringing of the bell and the likelihood that food was about to appear. So the idea is that the animal has formed an association. We can study that in animals in lots of different ways. One way that we can do that is by studying the ability of animals to learn where a hidden platform is in a large tank of water. So this task is called the Morris water maze. And the idea is that the animal's placed into the pool and he has to swim around and find an escape platform. And the escape platform is located about a centimetre below the surface of the water. And what we do is we add milk or paint to the water so that the animals can't see the platform. So they can't visualise where the platform is, okay? What they have to do is use the cues around the room, the spatial cues, to know where to go and escape from the water. So the idea is that they have to form an association again, but now between a particular place and the presence of the platform. And it might be a room like this with lots of cues like curtains and doors and posters and chairs, etc. And the idea is that they use these landmarks to find where the platform is. But the key thing is they're forming an association between the platform and the spatial location, the place. Well, the textbooks will tell you that you need LTP in the hippocampus to do this. We would argue that that's fake news. And we've got lots of evidence to suggest that actually this relationship between LTP and associative memory is not the case. So one example would be these GLUE1 knockout mice. So we train them on the water maze. Again, just to reiterate, the platform stays in the same place on every trial. The animal is starting from a different place each time. What he has to do is associate this particular place with the presence of the platform and getting out from the pool. And what you find is that the GLUE1 knockouts, I just should say that the GLURA and GLUE1 is exactly the same thing. Different groups all around the world call this protein different things. The GLURA and GLUE1 are exactly the same protein. What you can see is that normal animals, so these are the controls here, they get gradually faster and faster at finding the platform. So each day you put them back in the water, they get gradually quicker and quicker, suggesting that they've learned where the platform is. Okay? This is just a positive control group. You can ignore that for the moment. What's important is that the GLURA or GLUE1 knockouts improve just as quickly as the controls. Okay? So they're perfectly capable of forming an association between a place and the presence of the platform. We can do another memory test with these animals. I won't spend much time on this. Basically, the bigger this black bar, the better their memory is. And again, what you can see is that both groups have formed a strong memory of where the platform was. We can do the same thing on a different kind of maze. Now the animals are running around collecting food rewards. The idea is exactly the same. What the animal has to do is associate particular places or particular arms with the presence of food. And again, GLUE1 knockouts can do that just fine. So there's lots of evidence that they can form associations just fine. Okay, so what is wrong with these mice? Well, in the introduction you heard a whole list of different kinds of memory that people have studied over the years. There's one kind of memory you missed out, at least, and that's non-associative memory. Okay? And basically, after 20 years of studying these animals, we've discovered that what's wrong with these animals is they have an amazing deficit in a very different kind of memory, a non-associative form of memory, which underlies something called habituation. Okay? Now, all the memory tasks I've been telling you about so far involve forming associations between cues in the world, associating the bell with lunch, associating a particular place with the platform. This kind of memory is just a memory that something's familiar, okay? You don't have to necessarily remember it to be associated with anything else. It's just a memory that something's familiar. You've seen it before, you've heard it before, you've smelt it before, okay? So there's a memory trace that just provides a sense of familiarity. And of course, this underlies this property called habituation, which is the decline in the tendency to pay attention to a stimulus that has become familiar due to repeated or prior exposure, okay? That just means if you've seen it before or smelt it before or heard it before, you're going to pay less attention to it because you know about it. You don't need to pay attention anymore. Okay? Now, of course, there are certain stimuli in the world that it's very hard to ignore, however much you'd like to. The Donald. Look at that hair. Just... Oops, gosh. Does anybody remember a pop band called The Flock of Seagulls from the 1980s? Anybody? No? No? Nobody? You must remember The Flock of Seagulls. This is what happens when Flock of Seagulls get older. Right, is everybody looking at Donald? Okay? Everyone's had a good look. We're going to play a little spot the difference game. Okay? You ready? Now, presumably, you were all looking at Donald, and then when Boris appeared, you stopped looking at Donald and started looking at Boris. Yeah? Now, that's not because Boris is any more handsome or any less dangerous than Donald. It's just that Boris is new and interesting and he was surprising. Okay? You know about Donald. You've been looking at Donald already. You know about Donald. You don't need to pay any more attention to Donald. You've habituated to Donald. Okay? And your attentional mechanisms will say, I know about Donald. I don't need to look at him anymore. I'll look at the new and interesting and exciting thing. That's habituation. Okay? So how can we study this? How can we study this in our genetically modified mice? Well, of course, mice are far more discerning than we are, and they couldn't give two hoots about Donald or Boris. So we have to try something different. We do a very simple test called object recognition or object memory. And it's really very simple. All we're going to do is place the animal in a box with two identical objects, so like the I Love Tea mug, and we're going to let the animal run around, explore the mugs, sniff them, climb through the handles, touch them, rear up against them, for about 5 minutes, let's say. Then, after a short interval, what we're going to do is we're going to replace one of the mugs with a novel object like a beer bottle. Okay? And of course, what we'd expect is that a normal wild-type control animal will spend most of its time exploring the beer bottle. It knows about tea mugs. It doesn't need to look at tea mugs anymore. It's habituated to tea mugs. I know about tea mugs. Oh, that's interesting. That's new. I'll look at that. I'll look at the beer bottle. Now, of course, Carlsberg don't do behavioural neuroscience experiments. But if they did, the data would look something like this. Okay? So this is just the amount of time that the animal spends sniffing and investigating the two objects. So these are the wild-type controls. These are the normal animals. And what you can see is that they spend more time sniffing the novel object than they do the familiar object, just as we predicted would happen. What's interesting is that our GLUA1 knockout mice show no preference. They explore both objects to the same extent. They're showing no short-term memory for having seen the tea mug already. They failed to habituate to the tea mug. Okay? Now we can do exactly the same thing with a maze task, using spatial cues. So in this particular experiment we have a perspex maze. It could be in a room like this, lots of cues around the room. And the animals are allowed to explore two of the arms during an exposure phase or sample phase. So they're allowed to run around and sniff and smell and rear up and have a look around. And then after a very short interval, what we do is we give them a choice of all three arms. And what you'd expect is that normal animals will spend most of their time exploring this arm, the novel arm. Yeah, because it's new and interesting. I know about these arms, I've habituated to them, they're not interesting anymore. Again, that's exactly what we find. You can ignore the two sets of graphs on the left-hand side, concentrate on this, and these are the controls, the wild types. They're spending much more time in the novel, interesting arm, much less time in the other two arms, again, consistent with the fact they're habituating to these two arms. Again, what you can see is that the GLUA1 knockouts are showing no preference between the three arms. So they're showing no increased exploration for the novel arm. They're still exploring the start and the other arm. So they've failed to habituate to those two arms during the first part of the experiment. And I guess what's really striking here is that these are the same animals, remember, that could do that water maze task just fine. They could do the radial maze task just fine. So this is really a problem with short-term memory, particularly in situations where the animal needs to habituate to its environment. Okay? So we see deficits in habituation in these mice. And in some situations, these animals even go the other way and they start paying more attention to a stimulus that they've just seen rather than a brand new one. Okay? So their behaviour flips round completely. So in this particular experiment, we're going to do essentially the same experiment, but we're now going to look at how much time mice look at lights that we flash on in a little box, an operant box here. Okay? So all we're going to do is we're going to flash lights, different lights, and then we're going to look at how much time the animals look at the lights. Okay? And the way that we do that is we're going to present the lights in pairs, and sometimes we're going to present the same light twice, but sometimes we're going to present a different light as the second light in a pair. Okay? So we're going to have some same trials and some different trials. Okay? And we're just going to look at how much time the animals look at the lights. And what we find, as we'd expect, is that if you present the same light twice, the orienting response, so the amount of looking in the control animals, goes down. So they look at the light less the second time that it's presented, just as you'd expect, because they're habituated to the light. In contrast, what you find with the GLUA1 knockouts is that they do the opposite. They end up paying more attention to the light the second time they see it. Okay? So imagine, this is the experiment. So basically the light comes on, the normal animal goes, oh yeah, that's a light, that's interesting, okay. 30 seconds later, you show the same light again to the normal control wild-type animal. It'll go, oh yeah, I've seen that light. I'm not interested. Okay? So the orienting response comes down, as you can see. The glowing ones do the opposite. So first time they see the light, they're just like the controls. They go, oh yeah, there's a light. That's interesting. Second time you show them the light, they go, wow, that is the most amazing light I've ever seen in my life. That light is truly amazing. Okay? So the amount of attention that they're paying to the light is actually increasing the more that they see the light. Okay? In contrast to what the controls are doing. Okay, so that's habituation, which in some situations can result in something called sensitization, where the mouse ends up paying even more attention to the light that it's just seen compared to the first time it saw it, and compared to what it would see if you presented it with a brand new light. Okay? So the amount of attention that mouse is paying to the light is actually increasing with time. Right, so why is that relevant to schizophrenia? Well, we've known for a long time that these sorts of changes in attention might be very important in deficits, in illnesses like schizophrenia. And going back to some of the earliest descriptions of schizophrenia, people at Hoerl reported that patients often report an absence of a feeling of familiarity. Okay? So again, this idea that they're unable to reduce the attention that they're paying to things in their world. And subsequently, there's been lots and lots of demonstrations in human subjects showing deficits in habituation in patients with schizophrenia. These are some extracts taken from diaries of patients before they were diagnosed with the disorder. So these are extracts from diaries taken from during the prodromal phase. So this is the build-up to the point where the person ends up going to the doctor and gets a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So it's before the full-blown illness has kicked in. And what these people report is that they developed a greater awareness of, my senses were sharpened, I became fascinated by little insignificant things around me. Sights and sounds possessed a keenness, my senses seemed alive. I noticed things I'd never noticed before. My capacities for heightened sensory receptiveness was very keen at that time. I'd had that same intensity of experience at other times when I was normal, but such periods were not sustained for long. And the impression that you get from these anecdotal reports from the patients is a situation where their sensory world is on fire, it's alive. Sensory experiences, perceptual experiences are greatly enhanced in these individuals. Just like the Glow A1 mouse who sees the light for the second time and goes, wow, that's the most amazing light I've ever seen. Okay? So these patients, or these would-be patients, are showing this heightened sense of attention very early on in the etiology of the disorder. And the fact that this is happening so early in the disease suggests that it may be a very prominent driver of the development of the illness. Okay? So, and that's tied up with the idea that actually schizophrenia is particularly associated with something called aberrant salience. This idea that the individuals who are developing the disorder end up paying inappropriately high levels of attention to things that are happening in the world. And of course, in those sorts of situations, if you are paying too much attention to the wrong things, you are going to start to learn the wrong things about the world. You're going to start to attribute things to stimuli that normal individuals wouldn't. So the ticking of the grandfather clock is particularly loud, or the humming of the fridge is particularly strong. You might start to think that that means something that in a normal individual that wouldn't be the case. Okay, so just to wrap up then and summarise, memory deficits lie at the heart of most, if not all, neuropsychiatric disorders. And although most of the textbooks talk about associative memory, there's another very important form of memory, a non-associative memory, which underlies certain forms of habituation, the ability to tune out stimuli and reduce attention to stimuli. Glutamate receptors and synaptic plasticity may be particularly important for this non-associative form of memory that underlies habituation. And deficits in these receptors and the plasticity process that they support may be a very important driver of attentional impairments and aberrant salience that you might see in schizophrenia. And thank you very much.
I think you are an expert. Okay, we'll move
going
on.
straight on,
yeah. We're going to go straight on to Dr. Towse, who is an experimental psychologist at the University of Lancaster. And after this talk, then we will have a break for a bit of discussion where we can just ask questions on those two papers. Then we'll go out and have some coffee and tea. We'll come back for the philosophy paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So what I want to do this evening is very briefly talk to you about a particular form of memory called working memory, and I want to talk to you about what it is and why psychologists are interested in it, psychologists including me, and why in some ways we've been interested in it for some of the wrong reasons. So let me start by explaining what I mean by working memory. And it will often be defined in textbooks and in research papers in a variety of environments as the retention and transformation of transient representations. In the previous talk we heard about short-term memory, and it is about that temporary, short-term retention which is not defined precisely but is in the order of seconds rather than minutes, hours, days or years. But working memory is more than just retention. It is also about changing, transforming, updating, doing things with that memory. And that's often why it's referred to as something like the workbench of cognition. It's where things are actually happening. So from a sort of more practical or everyday point of view, think of the following two examples. You're asked in your head to add up 87 and 46. And I expect that you would be able to do this, maybe given a little bit of time. But in doing that, you're transforming the input, the 87 and the 46, into an output, something like 133. But also in doing that, there are subproducts. In, for example, adding the 7 and the 6 to form 13, which means you know there's a 3, but you have to carry the 1 in adding the 8 and the 4 together, and so on. So there are parts of the problem that you retain in order to get to the eventual product. And that's in the numerical domain. But imagine in the reading domain, you are reading a passage of text that goes something like this. John and Mark were furiously trying to solve the problem, and John was reminded of a similar difficulty some months back. Eureka, he exclaimed. We don't have problems with reading a passage of text like this. But in doing so, we need, towards the end, to work out what this pronominal referent he refers to. And most of us will understand it to be John. But we'll understand it to be John because we're remembering and using our working memory as we go through this reading passage to identify John basically as the subject or agent of the passage that we're focusing on. And I've made this example rather easy, but there are going to be many situations when we're reading a novel or reading non-fiction where some of the links between what we've been reading about and how it is meant to affect or interpret what we are reading in the here and now is going to be more complex and more difficult to calculate. But it's working memory that's going to be helping us to do that. So that's the kind of conceptual idea of what working memory is, as well as an illustration of the different domains in which we can expect to be doing it. So we're using working memory a lot, whether we're at the supermarket, seeing whether we have enough money to pay for something, or we're reading a book and trying to follow what's going on. So how do psychologists, cognitive psychologists, go about measuring working memory? Well, the popular way of doing it is something like this. This would be a task that I might use to test primary school children's working memory. I start with 2 sentences. And for each of those sentences, I've provided a sentence completion task. It's what's called a high-close sentence completion task because the completion is pretty obvious. There are 12 months in a blank. And the child will read that sentence and almost certainly supply the word year. That will disappear. They'll read another one. I wear socks on my... And we would expect them to say feet. At that point, we ask the child to remember the final 2 words in each of the sentences. So they now need to remember that they first said year and then they said feet. And if they can do that, we'll give them another trial in which there are 3 separate sentences. They're all up here on the screen for you, but for the child or the experimental participant, they're presented sequentially, separately, and without reference to the earlier items. But would they be able to read all those 3 sentences and then remember grow, door, and eyes? And if they could do that, we present them with 4 sentences, and so on. we can identify the maximum length of trial that can be presented with successful recall, the number of sentence final words that can be remembered. And the task requires processing, here sentence interpretation and comprehension. If you've no idea about the sentence you're reading, it will be that bit harder to come up with a semantically appropriate completion. And of course it requires memory, these end of sentence items. And most of the theoretical interest in the last 35 years or so has been on this maintenance phase, when you're doing something as well as remembering. So in the second sentence, in the 2-sentence lists, you have to read the sentence whilst remembering year. In the 3-sentence set, you've got 2 sentences where you're remembering a previous product. This is a reading span trial because it involves reading, but we can carry out an analogous task of mental operations where the child or the adult would carry out sums and then remember the product of those sums. Why do we do that? Well, it turns out that performance on a working memory task such as this is a very good predictor of other abilities that we're interested in knowing about. So here is some data that I was involved in. And on the x-axis, we've measured working memory, in this case reading span. Let's not worry about the scale here, but on the left is weaker performance, on the right is stronger performance. And we're comparing that, or looking at performance on a measure of school attainment for reading and for mathematics. And I think what's obvious is that there's quite a strong relationship between these two variables. So, just by testing a child's, these are primary school children between the ages of about 8 and 10, with a 15-minute test of reading span, I can predict about 50% of the variance on children's ability at number skill tasks in school. I can also predict, with a reasonable shout, how much better they will become at maths a year later. I don't have those data on the screen, but I can use the working memory measure, their size of working memory, to predict how much improvement we will see in those children as they go through school. Here are some other data from Sue Gathercole's lab. Again, on the x-axis, we've got working memory, calculated slightly differently, but on the y-axis is measured behaviour in the classroom of children. And what we find is in a variety of groups, including children with ADHD, as well as others, that working memory is related to classroom behaviour, classroom attentiveness. What used to be thought of in many cases as whether children were naughty or not. Indeed, Gathercole and others have argued that sometimes what we originally thought of as naughtiness or disruptive behaviour might actually be bigger problems with working memory. Children just can't follow all of the rules that they often need to follow in the classroom, and things are breaking down because of memory problems rather than or just because of problems with behaviour per se. So this measure of working memory, of how much we can remember in a reading span trial or something like that, is really good. It's doing lots of good work in allowing us to understand other cognitive tasks, and as a developmental psychologist or somebody with interest in developmental psychology, understanding children and their development. Indeed, the success, time and again, of working memory measures in predicting things in cognitive psychology that we're interested in has suggested to us that actually we've become to think of memory, this working memory, with a particular metaphor. And we think it's a bit like a suitcase. So sometimes implicitly, what we think of as working memory is a suitcase, and what's important is how big your suitcase is, because bigger suitcases allow us to do more things. We can go on bigger holidays, we can go on holidays for longer. And so what we do as psychologists is we then start to think about questions that revolve around the size of people's suitcases. We think about size as the variable that we should measure. It's really successful, it's really important. So those are the questions that we think about. Well, Abraham Maslow was a psychologist who wasn't at all interested in working memory. But he made an important point that's relevant here. He said, I suppose it's tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And so the potential problem is, if we only ever measure size of working memory, we'll frame all of our questions about working memory in terms of size-type things and size-type issues. So for a while, we've begun to think, is there any other way of thinking about working memory? Is there any value in thinking about working memory in any other way? We began to wonder whether we could develop a procedure which we're calling here working memory period, where period refers to the period of time or length of time over which something can be remembered. So instead of the traditional approach, as I've just explained it, of starting with, say, remembering 2 items, if you can do that, can you remember 3 items, you can do that, so on and so on. What we developed is essentially a measure where there are 3 things to remember, and if you're good at that, you go on to remember 3 things again, but over an extended period. So the processing, the sentence work, the arithmetic sums, whatever it is taking longer, without necessarily being that much more difficult, so that there's a longer time from the start of the trial to the point of recall where you have to remember these items. So, as I've already said, span scores, how much you can remember, is important. It dwells on the success of the whole ensemble of memory items. But because you start with 2 items, then move to 3, 4, and so on, it can sometimes be difficult to know what's happening within those items because you're varying them a lot across trials. The measure of working memory period that we've been trying to develop over recent years potentially gives us a different type of insight into the endurance, the functional endurance of the memories. And because we always have 3 items in one particular form of the test or 4 items in another, throughout the trial what varies is how long those 4 items last for. We can start to ask different questions about the importance of the first item or the importance of the second item, which will always be the first and second item because we're keeping length constant. So I thought I'd show you some data of what happens if you measure primary school children's working memory period rather than their span. And so there are about 180 children in this sample, working memory again measured on the x-axis on the bottom, and again children's reading skills and number skills to form British Ability Scale on the y-axis. And the point about this graph is, hopefully to you, it looks kind of similar to the graphs involving span. That is, understanding working memory period also gives us an insight, an ability to predict children's number skills and their reading skills. Moreover, measuring working memory period is consistent over trials. So if I measure it on one day and then I come back the next week and measure it again, we've got a reasonably robust measure that's the same on the 2 occasions. And of course that's important. If the measure wasn't reliable, then it would be highly unlikely that it would do predictive work. And there's also some details there about the fact that we can find this relationship overall, but also for children of different ages, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 11-year-olds, and so on. So this works across the primary school band. I said before that, unfortunately, we may have been captured rather too much by a kind of suitcase metaphor, a size-is-everything approach to working memory. What I think we'd like to argue is that careful use of other measures like working memory period suggests that maybe other metaphors might be useful as well. We've tried to argue that maybe it's useful to have something like a vacuum flask metaphor. One of the things we know about vacuum flasks is that the contents are perishable, and of course memories too are perishable. And if you have a vacuum flask, what you want is for it to be keeping something as it was when you make it in the morning, when you're up in the fells and you want your soup or if it's a hot day, you want that cold liquid to still be cold. You want it to insulate the contents from the outside world. And in memory situations, we also often want these memories to be insulated from the outside events that could interfere or degrade it. So, and of course, the thing about a vacuum flask, of course, in some cases, the size of the vacuum flask is important. But often it's not the only thing. I think it's a way of understanding what we're trying to do here, that it's the preservation that becomes more important. More generally, I think it then also allows us to think, well, what other questions might we want to ask about working memory? So as I've already said, we often do measure how big working memory is. And I'm interested in how it might change across development and how that might explain changes in developmental processes. And then I've just said, well, the durability of memory is important. But if durability might be relevant, maybe there are other dimensions as well that we also ought to consider more seriously or try and measure in other ways. The robustness of memory, for example. Or the links between memory and, the links between working memory and other forms of more long-term semantic representations that we might know about and might help us. And so I'm going to finish in about 5 minutes. Yeah, okay. So the last experiment that I want to describe is an illustration of how we tried to look at this last issue about the role of semantics. I just want you to focus on the left-hand side of the next slide. We carried out a listening span task. So children aren't reading a sentence, they're just listening to it, but they need to supply the final word. So before school, I eat we would expect somebody to say breakfast. A baby cat is called a kitten. So we'd expect them to say kitten and then later remember it. So far, just like a conventional size-based working memory span task. For items that children or adults couldn't remember, we then went back later and we gave them a cue to see if it might jog their memory or prompt them to correctly recall the item. And we used two types of cue. We used a cue that related to the original sentence. So in the first example, school, because the sentence was about before school. Or we used a cue that related to the target word itself. So an associate of breakfast is cereal. Notice that if sentence cues are going to work, they're going to have to work by reviving some memory of the sentence that itself will then revive a memory of the target word. Whereas the word cue is something that's more directly boosting or prompting the to-be-remembered item itself. So what did we find? Well, in this experiment, there are just shy of about 200 children and adults of different ages. And if you focus on the blue bars and the kind of, what is shown here is I guess pale red bars, in the sentence cue, the first part of that stat bar is the baseline performance, just how much these children remembered it. And that's going up with age. But then you see how much extra you get when you give them a cue. And you see that there's a substantial additional amount that can be recalled with a cue, both a cue to the original sentence and also a cue to the target word itself. So you can go from about 20% of items being recalled spontaneously to about 70% of items being recalled amongst these year one children with a sentence cue. And we then ran a little extra control condition called a regeneration condition, where we just asked people to remember again. We didn't give them any cues, but we wanted to give them a second shot at remembering. And these green bars are basically doing nothing at all. Just giving somebody another opportunity to remember isn't helping much, but clearly giving them particular cues is doing. What does this lead us to think, or what would we like to think on the basis of these data? Well, first of all, I think it's important that when we say about something not being recalled, that we don't fall into the trap of then thinking there's no memory of that item. Things are either remembered or forgotten in an experimental paradigm, but actually what's not recalled may still have a representation that with the appropriate cue can be produced. Also, there are different ways to strengthen or support recall from different points of the trial or task that you're using. But also I think it's important to recognise that in the sentence cues, in boosting memory for the sentence that might itself then affect the target item, we're showing that even though psychologists try to identify these to be remembered words and then think they're the only things that are important, the participant doesn't need to be bound by that way of thinking. And if they remember something of the sentence that helps them remember the item that they're being asked to remember, that's good. But also the cues to the sentence can then help them. So they're probably remembering much more than just the few to be recalled end of sentence words, but much more generic, semantic, sentential information that we're feeding into in an experiment such as this. So here's my last slide, an attempt to just come to some conclusions. Working memory is important. It's important conceptually when you begin to understand the number of times in which we need to be doing multiple things and remembering bits and pieces. How many minutes have I been talking for? How many more slides or sentences could I get in? I've got to keep running through these things to try roughly keep on track. Empirically, it's important as well. We've seen these graphs where there's a strong relationship between working memory and other things. For much of its history, working memory has focused with a very large emphasis, if not overwhelmingly, on the size of that system. And that's important. But I think there are reasons to at least go beyond only thinking about size. And here I've talked about memory persistence and the way in which support structures might be important. But that allow us to do more than thinking about it in only one way. And I'll stop there. Okay, so it's a very good question. I think the simple part is distinguishing it from short-term memory. Because in short-term memory tasks or short-term memory situations, the emphasis is really just on the retention. So I give you a series of numbers, 5, 2, 6, 4, 3, and I later ask you to remember them. Can you say back 5, 2, 6, 4, 3? So what I was talking about is working memory situations is where there's more ongoing cognitive activity. You're remembering the product of an item, sometimes you're changing that. I might give you a series of items, you remember the biggest ones, so you're constantly thinking about it. So it's that concurrent or ongoing cognitive work that tends to make something a bit more working.
There's no time limit to how long that could be.
As I said, we look at transient representations and it's often in the order of seconds, but indeed there isn't a fixed cut-off of when something stops being a working memory task. But the more one starts to be recalling incidents or events that go back minutes, certainly hours, or days, the less plausible it would be that it's that working memory system that is strongly determining performance.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? As academics, we're constantly making transitions on material, and we do it over hugely long periods of time. Is that working memory? I've been doing it for 20 years on one problem. That's working memory?
So I think the way it would often be conceived is that would be long-term memory.
That's long-term.
But long-term memory that you're going to be reactivating. And at particular points, you're going to be drawing information from long-term memory, and by making it much more active and by working on it, it's going to become much more of a working memory environment in the here and now. Okay, but wouldn't be doing that 24/7.
I wanted to ask about the size of working memory, as you mentioned, and well, how big it is. Is it a given thing that doesn't change over life? And if we think that we can develop the memory, is it just its efficiency or the size also? Is it a fixed thing for individual?
It's an excellent question. So we know that if you measure reading span in the way that I described it, reading span performance will get bigger as children get older, so it gets bigger in that sense. But there have been a number of arguments or deep debates in the literature about whether that's because the working memory system is getting bigger, or the distribution of effort on the memory part and the processing part is changing. So some people have argued that the working memory system is actually a fixed constant. But what's happening as children get older is some things are becoming more efficient and allowing other things to work better, and the end product is the number of items being remembered increases. Okay? So depending on which side of the theoretical or academic debate you want to be on that, you could take different views. But behaviourally, what gets remembered will be generally increasing with age.
Do we have any questions for the first speaker? I'm just curious. Yeah? All right, let's try.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the light experiment when the knockout mice actually pay more attention to the same light. Because I would guess that if it doesn't have the ability for habituation, it would react the same amount. Why? Is there a reason that it might react more to the same light?
Okay, so there's a very complicated psychological explanation, but I'll do my best to try and explain. So you can think of the light as being made up of lots of smaller individual components, okay? And you might start off by focusing on one particular aspect of the light, and the neurons that respond to that particular component of the light will start firing. Now, if you don't habituate to the stimulus properly, then those neurons will keep firing. And so you'll be paying attention to those bits of the light. But then as time goes on, you're going to also start noticing other bits of the light as well, other components of the light. And the neurons that fire to those will start firing as well. And so you'll gradually get an increase in neural activity and the representation of the light with time, because you'll start looking at one component and then you'll notice another one, but you won't lose the attention that you're paying to the first component as well. So the attentional response goes up. Is that?
Yes, yeah.
Can I tap in then? I was struck how clearly you need to remove the stimulus for the mouse to exhibit this sensitization, because if you have a tea mug and you add the bottle, they pay equal attention. What would happen if you remove the tea mug and then put the tea mug again together with the beer bottle? Would it pay more attention to the tea mug?
So I think that's an accident of the designs in those different experiments. So for example, if you take the wine maze experiment, if you run that in a particular way, so in a spatial situation where you put the animal in a novel environment, they'll run around, and the glowing one knockouts will run around a lot more than the controls. But their level of running around actually increases with time. And they're always in that environment, so you don't have to take it away and put it back. I think it's just an accident of the design of those two different experiments. So if you can leave them being exposed to the cues, and the attentional response will go up. You don't have to take the cues away and put them back.
Okay. So if you had two lights that flashed, it would still just stay at the one light and not at the other light?
If the lights were presented at offset in time,
yeah,
it would attend more to the first light than the second light. Okay. We've never done that because it would be very hard to measure that, but that would be the prediction.
But in that case, when we have the mug and the beer, shouldn't the mouse pay more attention to the mug as soon as the beer bottle comes in?
I would predict that there will be a certain set of conditions where exactly that will happen. It depends slightly on how long they've been exposed to the mugs in the first place, and then what the gap is between the mug and the beer bottle. But you're absolutely right. There should be a condition where they will show more exploration of the mug than the beer bottle.
I'm just going to ask anybody who asks a question to make your question as loud as possible, because we don't have microphones tonight.
So my question is, I have two questions, but I'll start with the second speaker. I was wondering, how do you tease apart attention and memory? Especially since you're working with children, you also had some children that had ADHD. So how do you tease apart whether it is actually the recollection of memory or whether the ability of the children to actually focus on that particular memory and complete the task?
Okay, so indeed, I described some of the work from Sue Gatherco's lab where they were working with populations with ADHD. I think, as I described the working memory tasks, they have an attentional or cognitively demanding processing component. So there's going to become a point where, in a sense, you can't tease apart these things because it's embedded or built into what you're doing. However, there clearly are issues about the demands or difficulties of the tasks and whether they're appropriate for particular children or particular age groups, and how those things change. So often experimental psychologists will be interested in trying to identify how different versions of the task, which might stress or fatigue or bore participants in different ways, would lead to different patterns of performance, and try and draw inferences from that about the role of some of those attentional factors in performance. I think it can be done, but it's going to have to be done in an indirect and an incomplete way, if that makes sense, because you're going to, as I say, be trying to draw on clues and cues that you get to try and build up a story or build up an account, rather than just being able to kind of get rid of it, the attention, or bring it in.
Compensate for it somehow.
Yes.
They were both wonderful talks, and thank you very much. I was particularly interested in the suitcase versus thermos flask metaphor, and in the way that apparently your discipline started by looking at memory in terms of space, and then moved on to look at it in terms of time. And I wondered speculatively whether there was emerging some kind of quantum of cognitive action, which had equivalents in, for instance, the way the meme can be both open and closed and so forth. But principally, you keep coming back to the idea of, and the question behind me, of capacity. And I wondered whether you relate the whole issue of capacity and behavior, or might find a relationship in Shannon's, I forget the theorem, but the one that says that if you overload a channel, then the overload comes out as noise. And I think of the ADHD syndrome as a kind of overloaded channel behavior. And I don't know whether you use information theory in the way that you see your discipline, but it did seem to me that some of those theorems might connect up with what you're talking about.
Yeah, to be fair to the discipline of memory, and other people might want to come in, but if you go back to some of the very early experimental work from Herman Ebbinghaus, it had a much more temporal component. He was interested in testing himself, learning to success a sequence of items, and then testing himself the next day or 2 days later, and so on. And there's a forgetting curve that he produced of how much gets forgotten or lost over a period of time. So if you want to think about the metaphors, then that more temporal dimension was important then. I was really focusing on how things had come to be in working memory, rather than necessarily saying that was kind of all of memory and for all of time. Very briefly, people do use information theory in Shannon's work, though if you talk to historians of psychology, then say some of the ideas of information theory have been corrupted in the past 60 years or so, in how that term information, which now tends to be used of as stuff, is going on, rather than the more classical way that it was used by people like Shannon and Turing before.
Do you have any questions for the first speaker?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. When you're positing a very sort of fundamental neuroscience mechanism like habituation as being responsible for schizophrenia, do you have an explanation for why schizophrenic symptoms don't show up until after adolescence? Do children not do habituation?
So that's a very good question. So, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't have any exposure to patients. But talking to people that do work up at the Warwick colleagues, what they often say is that these individuals are different from a very young age, much earlier than when a formal diagnosis is made. So I guess one might predict that, for example, during this prodromal phase, individuals will have problems with habituation, and this actually happens very early on, if not even from the point that they're first, from the point that they're born. And then actually what's happening is that you're getting a gradual disconnect in terms of where that person is in terms of reality. But the habituation deficit's been there from the outset, and it's just gradually becoming more and more obvious in those individuals. But actually those core driving symptoms like changes in attention may be there from much earlier. And some of these changes, of course, are seen in first-degree relatives and in individuals who are described as schizotypous and not classically schizophrenic, but showing some of the signs. I guess that's what's interesting about it, is it might be a very primary driver of what ends up being the final diagnosed condition.
Yes.
So this is for both of you, actually. I was wondering about how big individual difference do you find in working memory and, for example, in habituation, and how stable are these traits, or how malleable are these traits in adults?
We get very large individual differences. I was presenting some of them, but they're really pretty substantial. So many children on those reading span type trials will fail between sets of 2 and 3 sentences. But some children will go on to do 6. At one level, at one scaling, they're getting 3 times out what others are. How stable is this? That's an interesting question, because there's been a lot of interest in the past 15 years over the trainability of working memory. Arguments that working memory can be trained, and because working memory is linked to other skills, intelligence and school performance, that if you train working memory, you will train these other things. And there are strong commercial interests now in that idea, because there are sold products. That is something that's, let's say, hotly debated in the literature. As to whether you're really training working memory capacity, or you're training strategies and tricks that people use to get better at that task, which don't necessarily help translate and transfer to others.
So I've got a very poor answer, I'm afraid, which is we do everything we can to reduce the variability in our experiments to an absolute minimum. So the animals that we use are bred in such a way that they're virtually identical, apart from this one gene that's different between the 2 groups. But all the controls will be virtually the same, and all the knockouts will be virtually the same. So we do our best to minimise that, and that variability, which you could argue is a weakness or it certainly has limitations when you then want to translate to human studies. Having said that, we know that there are certain environmental factors that can change both how much attention you pay to a stimulus and then the rates of habituation. So, for example, how aroused the animal is can have a big influence on how they perform on these tasks, particularly in the context of how much short-term memory active short-term memory they exhibit.
There's somebody this side.
Yeah, I know there are lots of questions. We have plenty of time for questions. I think we'll break now for tea, and then we'll have our last talk. Hold on to those questions, there'll be plenty of time, okay? There's tea outside. I'll sort of scream when it's time to come back.
Yes, I think you. Are you a Mac user or? I'm normally a Mac user, so maybe John would mind. Yeah.
but it's
my instinct is to think that that's the same variable to explain slightly less of the time. You know, this time ratio is quite low time thing. I cash out quite well. Here are other questions that are asking
I think you're right. In other experiments, we've shown that's where we've got these there is what we've not had a chance to do is what the reasons are for the bits of the digital unit if you don't stop things. So right, I wonder if they're doing the same thing in the same way, essentially all we end up doing is justifying having the disciplines so that they learn faster and they can read from that behavior. But, you know, people a lot of chips again,
that's always had some pressure to it. They can't read on stuff. So if you're saying this is how much you remember, then it's not clear whether someone
yes, so the main
their memory is limited capacity or whether they're not putting the right things into it, right? Whether I'm involved to remember these whole sentences and
the same box three times. The normal
you
can use the running around is how much is the day out.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I didn't say, but also kind of raised.
But if you change the bird box to a different one, then the wild
in measuring how
because they know think that's interesting because the global ones are less interested in the new box than they were in the one that they so it's an incredible.
I wonder if emotions come in there as well.
Well, I'm absolutely sure that if you change the way that associative learning happens, it affects emotionality.
It has to, yes. And it does go via the limbic system.
So we've shown that you can recreate these phenotypes by so there's no drugs for I won't. We've made an antibody. I have, but Bradley just so Bradley made we had to join and Aliki made an antibody that binds to an epitope of the one that we can use like a drug. Put it into they're completely lose their shot at it. We've also done genetic rescue experiment where we put the glowing one back just into the hippocampus and bring the performance back. So a lot of this is happening in the hippocampus.
So, and what is the problem that you don't have a glowing one have a glowing two then inserted? Or you can't get your emotionless?
So the idea is that you can't rapidly translocate more receptors into the postsynaptic membrane. That's the classic trafficking model. Is that when any receptor opens, the calcium comes in, one of the things you want to do is get lots more glutamate receptors into that postsynaptic membrane, and you need glowing one to do that.
Is it only glowing one that's inserted?
It's not only glowing one that's inserted, but it seems to be important in that trafficking process. So at least that's the Malino theory. it's not true that there's no OTP in global work. You can get.
Well, there's many different forms.
Exactly. Yeah. And the whole one size fits all. Exactly. And the whole one size fits all idea of OTP, I think, is gone. I think people know now that it's different.
How is it on multitask? How do we do multitask?
Well, like a rotor rod.
Yeah. Because, I mean, cerebellum has...
They're fine with the rotor rod. Yeah, they're
I
fine.
mean, you also have automated receptor insertion into the middle.
You do. So it may be that the rotor rod is not a sensitive enough test. But certainly when we did the rotor rod back in the day, they seemed fine.
Erasmus not maybe? Erasmus
Yeah, I've
not
done
maybe.
that. Don't balance beams and rotor rods.
That could also be a sticky.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Really enjoyed that.
Cool. No, thank you. I hope it was to target.
No, it's perfect. I mean, that's the whole point. The point is to show people, it's not just medicine. You can give an introduction to medicine and everybody will like it, but there's something that's actually what they study it, and that is
Well, non-associative memory inhibitors is totally in the temple. I'm sure. The whole assistive learning watermelon story, I think, is totally over.
Yes, don't tell them.
Well, I'm
well, they got Bannerman first. You can get used to this. I was thinking we could do so many of these interdisciplinary workshops in March. But this is designed to be kind of just wanted to be able to see how different perspectives
Yes. Yeah. No, I think it's a different sort of kind of how the psychologists deal with an aspect of that issue, how they lost control and how they
That's why I often say to people,
yeah.
We now turn, as usual, to our speaker of philosophy, who is Dr. Christoph Hoerl, who is Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. And I'm very pleased to be here. I want to talk about a type of memory that David mentioned very briefly at the beginning of his talk, and Anita mentioned it as well, but that hasn't otherwise featured particularly prominently in the two talks we've heard so far. But that's actually the type of memory that you're likely to think of first when you think of the word memory, what the word memory means for you. And that's what's sometimes referred to as episodic memory. We have a distinctive way of remembering past experiences that we have, past events that we have personally experienced ourselves. You know about lots and lots of events in the past, but only those that you've experienced yourself, you can have this episodic memory for. So episodic memory is sometimes contrasted with what people call semantic memory, which is this knowledge of facts that you've accumulated over time. You know that Paris is the capital of France, for instance. You also know about historical events. You know about the Battle of Hastings and so on and so forth. But that's a different kind of memory from the kind of ability, as people sometimes put it, to mentally travel through time that episodic memory brings with it. Just to give you another example here of the difference between the two, Édouard Claparède was a Swiss neurologist living at the start of the 20th century. He had a patient who had amnesia. She couldn't remember things over time. So every time he met her, she assumed that she was meeting this person for the first time. She was acting as though she'd never seen him before. And then Claperet did something which I don't think psychologists nowadays would be allowed to get away with anymore. On one of the occasions when he was meant to meet this patient, he hid a pin in his hand, and then he held out his hand to shake the patient's hand and pricked her with that needle. And of course that was very painful for her. So then they had otherwise examination and so on, and she left again. And then the next time Dr. Claperet saw this patient, he again held out his hand to shake her hand, but she withdrew hers. But she didn't say, "You pricked me last time." What she said was, "Sometimes people hide needles in their hands." So she had no recollection of that particular event. She had no episodic memory, yet she had acquired knowledge of a fact, or what she thought of as knowledge of a fact. So I want to talk about this distinction between factual or semantic memory and episodic memory on the other hand. And how I want to distinguish between the two is by linking that distinction between episodic and semantic memory to another issue in the philosophical literature, which is sometimes referred to as the knowledge asymmetry or epistemic asymmetry between the past and future. I will use the word epistemic quite a bit in what follows, but all that means is it's got something to do with knowledge, with acquisition of knowledge, or with having knowledge. So there is some obvious difference between the past and future when it comes to knowledge or forms of knowledge. But it's actually quite difficult to pinpoint what exactly the difference is. Here is a section from a book by David Albert, who's teaching in New York at Columbia University. And he says, the sort of epistemic access that we have to the past is different from the sort of epistemic access that we have to the future. This, to put it mildly, nobody doubts. And nonetheless, there's a vast literature nowadays about the alleged difficulty of specifying exactly what that difference is. It's often pointed out, for example, that the difference certainly does not consist in our having knowledge of the past but none of the future. We do, after all, have knowledge of the future. We know, for example, that the sun will rise tomorrow. And if it's said that we know more of the past than we do of the future, this seems, according to the usual way of talking, true enough, but as it stands, not particularly informative. It seems to give us nothing at all that we can reason any further with, nothing that, as it were, we can sink our teeth into. Sometimes the focus is shifted to differences between the methods by which we can come to know things about the past and future. It's said more particularly that there can be such things as records of the past only, but this is almost immediately followed up with whining about the perennial elusiveness of exactly what it means to be a record, and cluelessness follows again. So you may have thought that there's a clear idea in your mind that we have a different sort of knowledge about the past than we have about the future, but what he's arguing here is actually is not really clear what that idea of that difference comes to. And I wanted to link this discussion to the distinctions between episodic memory and semantic memory. But before I can do so, I need to say a little bit about how currently philosophers conceive of why it is that we can have records only of the past and the future. And I see here, I use records here as a way of talking about not just memories, mental states, but also physical records, because that's the thing that philosophers so far have talked most about when they've talked about this epistemic or knowledge asymmetry between the past and the future. So why is it that we can have records only of the past and not of the future? Here's the standard story, as it's typically called. Take a footprint on a beach. That can tell you that there was a person walking there in the past, but there's nothing that could, in a similar way, tell you about future events. Why is that? Now think about the footprint. The section of the beach containing that footprint is a physical system that exhibits a relatively low state of entropy. You may have heard of that notion of entropy. What it basically means is it exhibits a relatively high order. It's quite ordered in a specific way. There's a very sharp or neat line that you see in the sand that you wouldn't normally expect to find in the sand if you're just looking at sand that's blown about by the wind. Given the way systems like a beach evolve over time, this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't expect to rise spontaneously over time, just from the movements of grains of sand on the beach. Movements of grains of sand on the beach that are blown about by the wind will typically just generate more kind of disorder, more mess. But what you have here in front of you is something that exhibits quite a bit of order. So therefore, the standard story goes, that's what makes the footprint capable of acting as a record, because it records an interaction between that section of the beach and some other physical system exhibited a low state of entropy, quite a lot of orderedness, namely a human foot or a human walking along the beach. So that's the general story as it's told at the moment in philosophy about why we can have these things like records of the past, but we haven't got anything similar that could tell us about the future in an analogous way. So what I want to do in what follows is starting off from this idea of a record, then distinguish between records in the sense in which the footprint is a record and memories, and then I want to distinguish further between memories, semantic memories on the one hand and episodic memories on the other, because I think semantic memories share the same sort of asymmetrical feature that records in general have, that they have to be formed, they have to have been formed in the past. That's what makes them asymmetric in time, that we can only have semantic memories if they have been formed in the past. However, as I will also show, that doesn't mean that the knowledge that is retained in semantic memory itself exhibits a past-future asymmetry. You can have knowledge in semantic memory also about future events, if you've worked them out in your head, for instance. That's where episodic memory is different, because episodic memory is a form of memory that exhibits the epistemic asymmetry also to the person who has the memory herself. If you have an episodic memory, it's clear to you that that memory can only tell you something about the past and not the future. I'll try to talk you through why I think that's the case. So first of all, let's think in general about how memories in general are different from records like a footprint on a beach, on a sandy beach. I want to say that they're also a form of record, but they're records of a specific type of activity. They're records of epistemic activity. Memories are records of knowledge-seeking activity. And if that activity was successful, that would have led to the formation of a piece of knowledge. Namely, that's the thing that we call the memory that's then been formed. So memories are the records of the formation of the very state of knowledge that the person's remembering then consists in. And that also explains a difference between the footprint in the sand and a state of memory that you can be in. Because the footprint in the sand is not the state of knowledge. You have to do something, you have to infer from the footprint to the person walking on the beach in order to gain some knowledge from looking at the footprint. But your memories themselves, you don't infer anything from them. Those just are your states of knowing things. When you have a memory, that embodies a piece of knowledge. You don't have to infer anything from it. So, just like the footprint, I think we can tell a general story according to which semantic memories also have to be records. And there will be a story about how the brain works that is kind of similar to what we heard about the footprint in the sand, that explains why the formation of the memory has to precede your having the memory itself. So as I said, they're records like footprints, but they're records specifically of knowledge-seeking activity. They also, as I said, embody knowledge. They're pieces of knowledge. If you have the semantic memory that Paris is the capital of France, that's a piece of knowledge that you possess. You don't have to carry out any further work in order to access that knowledge. But here we need to distinguish between the knowledge that semantic memories embody and what they are records of. Because the knowledge that a semantic memory embodies is not knowledge of the things that they are records of. That becomes particularly clear when you think about semantic memories, as I said before, that you can have that concern the future rather than the past. So think of a scientist, for instance, who has to work out the flight path of a space probe into the far future. That may be a person who comes to learn a lot of facts about the positions, future positions of different planets and so on and so forth, and the future behavior of that flight probe. That might be a person who hasn't got much interest in the past in the first place. So here you might end up with a person who, as far as their knowledge of facts is concerned, actually has more knowledge of facts about the future than about facts about the past. That's possible, but that's only possible within that semantic memory, within the knowledge of facts. There's no built-in past-future asymmetry in the knowledge that semantic memories can embody. And that's exactly where I think epistemic memories are different from semantic memories. So, as I said before, episodic memory is a type of memory that allows us to remember particular events themselves as they happened in a way that's different from simply retrieving information, from simply retrieving facts that you've learned. And in contrast to semantic memory, it seems to be that the knowledge that's retained in episodic memory itself exhibits a temporal asymmetry. We can remember events in that specific way only if they've already happened. Moreover, that's not just something that we find out by doing the psychology of episodic memory or so. We know that ourselves when we have the episodic memory, that it is a type of memory that we can only have of past events. It presents us directly with the past. Some philosophers think that episodic memory is really the source of our concept of the past in the first place. That if we didn't have any episodic memories, we wouldn't know that there was such a thing as the past. But in what way is episodic memory special, that it has that built-in pastness, as it were, past directedness, as it were? I want to make a suggestion about why that is, that links it to the specific kind of knowledge that is retained in episodic memory. Drawing on the work of a former colleague of mine who's called Matthew Soterio, who's now in London. He suggests that what we should think of as episodic memory is the retention of knowledge of what it was like to experience the event. That's a specific type of knowledge, and that's the knowledge that's retained in memory. Why think, though, that because it's that type of knowledge that's retained in episodic memory, that makes episodic memory itself a different form of memory from other memories? Why, in virtue of it being the retention of knowledge of what it was like to experience an event, should we think of that as a separate, distinctive category of memory? I think we can look to some work in the philosophy of mind to get some sort of story as to why this constitutes a separate form of memory. Because there seems to be an essential connection between phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what it's like to have a certain experience, and first-hand experience. Because the only way in which you can come by knowledge of what it's like to have a certain experience is by having that experience yourself. With the kind of knowledge that you can retain in a semantic memory, there might be various different ways in which you could acquire that knowledge. You might read about a fact, you might hear about it from somebody else. It might be that you've kind of learned about it yourself through your own experience. But these are all different ways in which you can come by the same piece of knowledge. In the case of knowledge of what it's like to have a certain experience, the only way in which you can get that knowledge is having the experience yourself. You may have come across a thought experiment by a philosopher called Jackson, who thinks of Mary, the brain scientist, who learns everything about the visual system, but is confined in a black and white room. The only study materials that she has are in black and white. But she knows everything that goes on in the brain when you look at a right apple, for instance, and so on. What Jackson points out is that, now, think of Mary as having this really great deal of knowledge about vision and colour vision in particular. Still, because she's in that black and white room, she will lack a crucial piece of knowledge, namely what it's like to see red. Because that what it's like knowledge you can only get through first-hand experience for actually looking at a red thing. This point is also sometimes put by saying that there's a particular way in which experience is epistemically transformative. It furnishes you with a particular kind of knowledge that you have no other means of obtaining. And I'm suggesting that that's the kind of knowledge that's retained in episodic memory. And that gives us a story as to why, when you have an episodic memory, it's obvious to you how you acquired that episodic memory, and that it was acquired by you in the past. Just to illustrate that with an example, here is a story told by Alfred Ayer. He says, I myself remember very little about my early childhood, but I've acquired beliefs about it which, judging by the evidence available, may very well be true. Now, it sometimes happens that a belief of this sort transforms itself into a memory. The transformation may be uncertain. One says, I do dimly recollect it, being still not quite sure whether one does or not, whether one has not been talked into remembering something that one doesn't really remember at all. But it may also be that all of a sudden the event comes back to one quite clearly. One has no doubt that one remembers it. And I ask, what exactly has happened there when you switched from knowing that it happened, but not remembering it, to remembering it? Well, what I would suggest is that we can think of what comes back to the subject in Ayer's example as knowledge of what it was like to experience the event in question. And that can explain the distinctive nature of the memory, that there's suddenly this switch in their experience, that they themselves experience that they're suddenly remembering the thing in a completely different way. And note that because, as we've seen, experience itself plays an indispensable role in equipping us with that knowledge in the first place, when you retrieve that knowledge, its source is obvious to yourself. And that's different from beliefs retained in semantic memory, which could come from various different sources. So unlike knowledge retrieved from semantic memory, because it's knowledge of what it was like to experience the event in question, it can't leave its source open. It's knowledge that you can only have through going through the experience yourself. And that, I want to suggest, can help explain a sense in which episodic memory itself locates what is remembered in the past. unlike semantic memory, it's itself knowledge of the very epistemic activity that it's a record of. And I think the upshot of what I'm describing here is nicely captured by this passage in a work by a philosopher called Hoerl, who points out that at first you might think of, when you think of this type of memory that takes you back to the past, as memory for particular past event. You seem to remember the event itself. But as he points out, at the same time, that type of memory is clearly also, or you only remember the past event itself, because what you're remembering is your own experience of the event. So he says, it's emphatically true that when I remember the past event, my explicit thematic attention is on the past event and not upon myself. But reflection discloses that, in fact, I'm also implicitly aware that the event was an object for a past act of experience. That is what I now remember. What I now remember, the event, is not the event taken simply, but an event as experienced. It's not itself a hypothesis, but a present phenomenological fact. Okay, thanks very much.
Right, we have plenty of time for questions. We can go back to the other. Yes, there were a couple of questions here. Let's start there.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was thinking while you were talking that my most vivid episodic memories are when they've been very emotional experiences. And so the effect of the emotion on making the memory vivid. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship there?
Well, I think the psychologists can also tell you a little bit about this. I mean, certainly, I think it falls in quite naturally with what I've been talking about. If the experience that you've had in the past was a particularly rich experience of some sort, or
bad.
Yeah, it could be bad, it could be good. That makes it particularly memorable because it is, as I say, it's the experience that you remember, and it's only through remembering the experience that you're remembering the past events themselves. So if the events themselves didn't have much of an impact on your experience, then your memory of the event will also be different.
Sometimes one can't remember the actions of what happened, but you can remember the feelings very strongly.
Yes. I think you can usually still remember the gist of what was going on, but I think what you're remembering there is the way in which the events there have added something to the stock of experiences that you can kind of look back upon, and that's still kind of in your mind. Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
No.
No?
I was wondering about, you said that, so the phenomenal character is something that's really important for episodic memory, how it's sort of that link to you having experienced that. But like a classic example of semantic memory you might think would be knowing what apples taste like, or like knowing what colour looks like, or something like that. How does that fit into, I mean, that seems like a memory that you can only have if you've experienced eating apples lots of times. Like Mary would have no experience of what an apple tastes like.
Yes, so what I would want to do is actually introduce yet another distinction between different kinds of memory. So I think you're right that, and that's actually the main thing that philosophers talking about is what is like knowledge should be talking about. There's a memory simply for what certain experiences are like. So what Marmite tastes like and so on. You have no idea until you've tried it. I want to say that it's true of that type of memory as well, like you can only acquire it through experience. But there's a more specific type of memory which is tied to tied to the particular time at which you had the experience. And that's this remembering what it was like to have the experience. That you remember the change that has happened within you itself at that point in time in episodic memory in virtue of your finding out what having that experience is like. So episodic memory has a connection with time in which simply knowing what Marmite tastes like, for instance, doesn't have a specific connection with time. Although you can figure out for yourself that if you know what Marmite tastes like, you have to have tasted it in the past. But that would be an inference. Yeah, that would not be a memory of a past event.
I'm just wondering, Christoph, thanks, how you'd handle this kind of Wittgensteinian kind of critique that I kind of moved to issue by what you're saying. So you start out by trying to encourage us to think that there is a question we can ask, which is why we can only have records or memories of the past. I mean, I don't know, maybe we could use the word why differently, but because my worry is that kind of even the very question kind of misconstrues an internal or a conceptual or grammatical relation as something which is external or factual. If I think, for example, of questions like why I can only have aspirations regarding the future, or why my fist can't throw a punch at itself, or why I can only smile using my face, or my mouth and my eyes. If someone said to me, well, why can you do those things, and wanted an explanation, I'd probably tell them to stop. I'd explain that it's just part of the grammar of what it means to smile and so on. And so my worry was, having severed an internal relation, then it looks like there's room for an explanation of a sort, and so we get kind of ideas opened up like episodic memories allow us to remember events, or they present events as lying in the past, or there's an epistemic means by which we come by knowledge of what it's like to have an experience, of having an experience, or it's because we have the experience ourselves, we're taken back to the past. But so again, my thought is that, but if we don't, as I put it, sever the internal relation, you know where I'm kind of probably coming from, then is there really an explanatory kind of tack that's needed to be taken?
I think part of what I was trying to do at the beginning may be seen as at least partially trying to answer that, which is, do you think it's obvious that there's some sort of different relation in which we stand to the past versus the future that has something to do with knowledge? But then try to look at it in more detail, and you suddenly have to acknowledge, actually, with respect to many pieces of knowledge that we have, there just isn't this asymmetry in the first place. And I think there's a danger of applying what Hugh Price calls the double temporal standard, that you might think, so we're inclined to think, so if you think of Albert's example of, we know that the sun will rise tomorrow, for instance, we have that knowledge. Somebody might say, yeah, but we don't know it for certain, and might think that there is a deep asymmetry between past and future in that sense. But that ignores the fact that your memories could also be misleading, and there's lots of evidence that our memories are misleading us all the time. So it's not a matter of certainty. So then the project is basically to drill down to where is it that idea of a past-future asymmetry in our epistemic standing comes from, and I think that's the project really I want to pursue.
Yes.
What are the ideas of the distinction between nature of memory as a phenomenal object, where we try to remember how the event was, and of the event itself? I just want to ask how much of the record we can hold up to the, let's say, neurophysiological evidence which shows that actually seeing a visual scene and imagining it or remembering it involves the same, eye movements and brain regions. Wouldn't that simply fall, because then it's the same thing?
So there are people, as you say, that there are people who think that there isn't really an interesting difference in kind, for instance, between imagining future events and remembering past events. I certainly wouldn't want to go so far. But what you say actually ties in with the way in which some philosophers understand why it is that you can come to have knowledge of what it was like to experience an event only through experiencing the event yourself. Because what they say is that what that event of experiencing the event equips you with is precisely the ability to imagine it or to have a memory image of it, conjure up a memory image. So that would be partly in line with the idea that imagery has a crucial role to play in memory, even though it might be a slightly different role than when we're just imagining stuff.
How would a virtual reality memory then compare to a realistic reality, an actual reality?
Can you say more about what you mean by virtual?
Well, for instance, you could have virtual reality goggles on and experience traveling into a foreign country. You could listen to music or sounds at the same time, maybe even the smells, as opposed to actually traveling and having the memory of being in that bazaar. I mean, you could virtually reality parts and everything.
Yeah. So clearly, what you would then be able to remember is what it was like for you to have that virtual reality experience, but which is still inducing an ongoing experience in you. So it produces visual impressions for its.
But would the memory of the actual experience be different?
I wouldn't think so, no, because that, again, what do you have to do in order to provide you with those memories in virtual reality? Well, take the case of Mary the brain scientist. You would have to produce a red experience in order to give her that memory of what it's like to see red, whether that's the red of an apple out there in the world or red as produced by a virtual reality.
But would her realization that one is created or is created for the purpose of experience, whereas the other one is just, would that impact on your memory? Wouldn't you value an actual experience more than
I think that's a very interesting question as to why we think so. So that there are discussions in philosophy about why it is that we are abhorred by the fact that we could be kind of just stuck in a virtual reality machine all the time, having the most fascinating fake experiences. Why we think, no, you have to be out there in the world, and we want to value that, even though it might be much harder and much more painful.
I'm just thinking here of a puzzling situation but very, very, in certain respects, almost universal situation, which I wonder what your thought is on this. Supposing that Jane is not a visual scientist, but is a developmental psychologist specializing in infant development and knows everything about that's available to a researcher about what occurs in the first year of life. Supposing that Jane might also be a mother and have opportunity to observe infant development very closely, and we know that Jane has experienced her own infant development, and yet almost certainly Jane does not have conscious episodic memories of her first year of life. So I was wondering, what is the difference here between Jane and Mary, that Mary has never had the opportunity to see colour, whereas Jane has experienced her in the first year of life but does not have access to these memories in an episodic sense.
I mean, if you think about it that way, if you have Mary who acquires knowledge of what it's like to see red, you could also have her suffering from some brain damage and having some colour-related amnesia. After that, having had the experience, doesn't make a difference as to whether she still continues to know what it's like to see red. So I would treat these cases equivalent with each other. But I also agree with you, by the way, haven't mentioned that. I think one reason why episodic memory in particular is interesting is that it seems to be, as I said before, the type of memory that you think of first when you think of the idea of memory. But many people have argued that it's actually a uniquely human ability, that animals don't have episodic memories. They can't cast their mind back to the past. And indeed, in human children, it only develops very, very gradually.
Animals do have. Animals, otherwise you can explain how they find a platform in a maze, right? It needs to remember where to go, so it needs to...
It needs to remember where to go, but that doesn't mean that it has to know that it's been there before.
Yes, I think the evidence is also that while episodic memory develops rather gradually in infants and young children, it is present in some form before the age of 3 or 4, which is when most of us have our first conscious memories.
Yeah, that's it.
So effectively, to all of you, with all the research that you've done in all the different areas, has it improved, have you had any personal experience of your memory being improved? Whether it's short term, long term, working memory,
Who wants to start? Let's start at the beginning. No, not you, David.
Oh, all right. I think forgetting is exaggerated. I think there's less forgetting going on than we maybe tend to think. And actually, what's usually happening is a failure to get the right retrieval cues.
Yes.
And so, a very interesting experience becoming a parent was going back and watching all the TV shows that I'd watched when I was 5 and 6 years old. And if you'd asked me, could I remember those shows, I would have said no, not at all. You sit down and watch them, and you can almost word for word recount what's coming next out of Bagpuss's mouth. It's incredible. And I think you just, for a lot of the time, you just don't have the right retrieval cues. So I think we probably have in our brains a lot more memories than we're able to express a lot of the time. It's just finding the right retrieval cues to bring those out. And I think there's another interesting distinction between semantic and episodic memory, which obviously we can't study in animals, is the role of language in that. And again, I'm sure both the other speakers know more about this than I do, but obviously language could play a huge part in terms of making those distinctions, in terms of potentially very easy to retrieve facts that you've semanticized and could therefore index and retrieve very efficiently.
I remember when I was carrying out an experiment not long after I got my PhD, and it was with a child in a primary school, and it was involving a short-term memory experiment where I presented letters and asked for them to be recalled back. And I'd explained the task to this child, and her response was, "Oh, I'm going to be good at this, I know letters." And it made me think, well, yeah, you know letters, that may not be the only thing you need for this task. And sure enough, her memory was fallible. So to answer your question, I think probably what I've learned most is about the fallibility of what I do and the ways to address it. So having it in the forefront of my mind that my working memory is very small can be helpful in terms of the strategies or the things that I do to hang on to and preserve the very few things that I can.
I think it's actually the cliche about academics that they always work on the things that they're worst at. So a colleague of mine who's hopeless at getting around a city or building once ran a 5-year, very prestigious research project on spatial representation. So I wouldn't be very confident in my memory of all of that.
Is there anything you haven't asked a question?
Yeah, it's actually more a question on the mechanism underlying memory. So that's because we heard a lot about different types of memory, associative, non-associative, episodic, working memory, short memory, and also, especially in your talk, it was clear that, for example, the glutamate system seems to be more involved in non-associative learning. So generally, do you think that different types of memory have different underlying neural networks or neurotransmitter systems, or to what extent do you think that certain substages like encoding are kind of similar across different types of memory?
So I certainly think the neurobiology and the mechanisms for non-associative and associative are dissociable. They're different mechanisms. I think the studies that we've done in the mice show that very nicely. I'm not saying glutamate isn't important for associative memory. I'm not sure there's very good evidence that it's important for it, but I wouldn't go that far. I mean, to backtrack slightly, I think obviously plasticity is such a ubiquitous phenomenon within the central nervous system. It's hard to believe that it isn't important in pretty much every aspect of brain function. But in terms specifically of glutamate receptor-driven plasticity in the hippocampus, I think the evidence for it being involved in associative memory is very weak.
I think it's also interesting to note that different memory systems work differently. So motor memory, you need time to acquire a skill, but then you will not forget it. You may lose some finer ability, but you will not lose the ability to ride a bicycle. Whereas episodic memory or semantic memory, sometimes you just hear a fact once and remember for the rest of your life, and sometimes you hear a fact 20, 30, 40 times, and still you can't retain the information. Ask any student here, I'll tell you. And how does that work? Because the underlying mechanisms, synapticity, are thought to underlie both, and actually glutamate is thought to play a role probably in both to some extent, though using different receptors.
I mean, quite similarly to your question, I come away thinking, well, is there anything that unifies all these different kinds of memory? You say memory, because I came here tonight, we're going to talk about memory, and I thought, what do I think about memory? You know, where do I start? And then I thought, oh, okay, so there's working memory, this memory, and then I was wondering, why are they all memories? Right? But what is it that unifies them, either at the brain level or even just at the conceptual level? I find that myself a little perplexing. I don't know if is that something that you think about, or is it, well, we just put different memories?
I think memory is a sufficiently broad concept that it almost does represent some very different things. So we've not talked about autobiographical memory, but memories of our past experiences essentially make us what we are. Our identities are a little different in some respects from our autobiographical memories. And clearly that is a very different environment from some of the associative memories we have, which are very specific and work in a particular way. So I think you're right that breadth is really very wide.
Is there in the brain a different part of the brain used for episodic memories and semantic memories? I mean, is this a conceptual distinction that's being made, or is it also a biological distinction in how bits of the brain come together to create those two different kinds of memory?
So what I, as a philosopher, know about the empirical literature suggests that they are different, to some extent different locations, and the evidence that there is for that is precisely the evidence from people with amnesia. So you can have people who, because of some brain hemorrhage or some accident or so, completely lose the capacity to remember in episodic memory particular past experiences that they had, particular things that happened to them, the events themselves. But they retain the capacity to remember that certain things took place, that certain things happened, and also to some extent the capacity to learn new facts even. But they've just lost the ability to...
So when you were talking about this thing which I think many of us have experienced, memories of being young, when you know the fact about something which happened to you, but basically it doesn't feel the same as a memory, and now I now have a word for it. It's a semantic memory. I didn't know that before. And because you don't know what it felt like to be there, and you were speaking of when suddenly, sometimes, something triggers, something which you've known from a photograph, or because you've been told it so many times, and suddenly you feel you've you remember it. Is that because your brain is suddenly doing something different? The neuroscientist, maybe I should be asking. Do you see what I mean?
Memories are very malleable. You can implant memories into people.
Yes, you absolutely. They're not reliable.
Yeah.
You can be persuaded that you remember something. But that feeling of, as he was describing it, of I remember it rather than I know it. I know it happened. Oh, yes, now I remember it. Is it, and it can be planted, it may not be true, but is it that different neurons are firing? Is it that something different is happening in the brain?
Well, I think that's the evidence, that's what people believe based on people with different brain lesions, is that you can dissociate these different kinds of memories or retrieval processes. I still think it's an interesting question as to whether what you're looking at are qualitative or quantitative differences, because you could also argue that in lots of these situations, one memory is just stronger than the other, and so it produces a more emotional response than, say, another memory. So whether they're qualitatively different or quantitatively different is I still think is somewhat of an open question in the literature.
Okay, I'm going to draw it to a close now because, we're past the 7:15. Thank you very much and hope to see many of you again next term. Thank the speakers.